Kamal Santa Maria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, the COP17 summit in Durban and the real costs of climate change. Is carbon trading working? One of the biggest schemes to cut carbon emissions could be one of the biggest wastes of money. And if it doesn't work, what does the future hold for the world's lowest lying islands on the front line of rising sea levels? Plus the alternatives, electric cars in Japan and waste recycling in Pakistan prove something can be done to help. So it's that time of year, the time when everyone talks about climate change. Delegates gather at a UN summit. They threaten to come up with the elusive binding agreement on reducing carbon emissions, and then they don't, and we have to wait another year. It sounds very pessimistic, I know, but that is how it's unfolded in Copenhagen 2 years ago, and then in Cancun last year, and as such, the hopes for Durban 2011 weren't exactly high. So what we are doing, instead of focusing on those would-be agreements, we're following the money. What's being spent, what isn't being spent, what's being spent smartly, and seeing if that's making any difference while the search for a Kyoto Protocol replacement goes on. Here's how we're going to do it. Three main themes to explore. Small islands first up, i.e. the low-lying ones, which will be the first to feel the effects if sea levels keep rising. How can they stay out of harm's way? Then carbon trading, which is supposed to cap the amount of emissions made by companies, but could be just a huge waste of money. And we've got two sides to that argument. And alternatives too. If all this isn't working to combat climate change, then we've got the examples from Pakistan and Japan, which are in their own small way. Before we do any of that, though, I want to welcome STEFF GAULTER to Counting the Cost. STEFF, of course, senior meteorologist here at Al Jazeera English, to talk through the science behind it all, STEFF, because people can argue as much as they want about joining up to binding agreements or not, but can they argue with the evidence, with the science?
Well, certainly for the last 150 years, temperatures across the globe have risen. Global temperatures have risen. No one really in the scientific community is saying that they haven't. But there are a couple of other theories out there because people would like to be taken off the hook. People would like it not to be our fault. So people are saying, well, climate change has actually stopped. Global temperatures have stopped rising. Maybe it's the sun that's doing this rather than our emissions. Or perhaps this is just normal. This is what is expected to happen in the globe. It'll come, it'll go. OK, well, let's pick up your first point then. Global warming has stopped. How could someone think that? Well, say 2011, this is supposed to be the 10th or 11th warmest year on record, but it's not the warmest year, if you see what I mean. So the graph would take you all the way up to the top for over the last 150 years, but it doesn't peak year on year. And the reason for that is actually to do with natural fluctuations. So we've got La Nina conditions with us. You've heard me harp on about that. And that's to do with the Pacific waters. They're actually a little bit cooler than usual. And usually that would mean global temperatures might be a little cooler. Also, volcanic eruptions, they affect the temperatures that we have on a year as well.
So is this, and this I think was your third point that you made, that this is just the way it is. There are variations over hundreds, thousands of years, and this is just the pattern we're in now, and we have to accept that.
Well, there have been a lot of studies done over the last thousands of years, some trying to go back even further. Several different studies, all independent, have all come to the same conclusion. This isn't natural. I mean, essentially, what we're doing is we're throwing a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We've known for a long time now, around 150 or 200 years, that the greenhouse gases do increase temperatures. We've known that. This isn't new. And so if we're still throwing carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere, it can only be increasing the temperatures here.
All right, STEFF GAULTER, our senior meteorologist here at Al Jazeera English. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Right, we want to start running through some of the issues now. First of all, rising sea levels, because, well, who gets hit by those first? The world's small islands, of course. And joining us from the COP17 in Durban to talk about that is DESSIMA Williams, chair of AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. DESSIMA, I'm reading some of your comments here that the window of climate safety is closing and actions need to be taken to reduce emissions by 2015, before 2015, which is 3 years away. How did this become so urgent?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The urgency is not diminished. In fact, when we were in Copenhagen, we were calling for urgency, as well as when we were in Cancun. The scientific reports during 2010 suggest that we've had an increase in emissions. We have had the hottest year on record in history. And it means that we must more urgently tackle this question of bringing down emissions worldwide so that we could get to a safe zone. Now, there have been some proposals that we should wait to agree to do that in 2020. This is absolutely a non-starter for the islands. We cannot wait until 2020 for action, for decisions. We must, as all the indications, the scientific evidence suggests, we must begin to bring down our emissions immediately and peak by 2015, so that after 2015 we could begin to return to a safe zone, which we are rapidly moving out of in the present time.
Do you have a tough time convincing people about this urgent need for action? The smaller islands, they are on the front line when it comes to rising sea levels, but I wonder if, in amongst all the big players of Europe and North America and China and other parts of Asia, I wonder if the small islands are getting as much exposure as they need.
Well, I think all your viewers and listeners, for example, in the Middle East, would themselves be experiencing a big change in the climate. And so we have been able to, as islands, to generate a coalition of over 100 countries, including some from your region, who are calling for very ambitious, early and urgent actions here in Durban. It is not just the islands, it's led by the islands because we are on the front line, but it includes all of Africa, and we are here in Africa in solidarity with the famines and the droughts that are unfolding in Africa, and they have signed up for a call for urgency and high level of action on the part of all the countries.
In the meantime, though, what can you do? What can a small island do to, you can't necessarily prepare yourself against acute natural disasters, but as the sea levels gradually rise, what do you do?
Well, we are here at the conference, yes. The first thing we are doing here is we have laid out a very ambitious agenda that should be possible. First, we need and we insist on a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is a major and perhaps the sole global instrument we have for addressing climate change. We want to see that renewed with ambitions raised in that, so there will be more commitment to reducing greenhouse gases. Now, outside of the negotiations, we have taken in the last year a program of over $10.5 million on renewable energies to transform on average, there are 27 islands in this program, and generally we will bring 20% of our energy usage into renewables, and that will save a tremendous amount of emissions. Although we are among the lowest emitters in the world, we are taking those kinds of actions to bring as our contribution. We will always use gas and oil, yes, but we could reassess the percentages so that we could use more of our natural resources to help save our countries from the scourges of climate change, and we could also bring about a new economic impetus that is based on clean energy, on the green economy. Those are some of the things that AOSIS and the islands around the world are already engaged in, and we think that people everywhere, big and small, can do their part.
That is DESSIMA Williams from the Alliance of Small Island States. Thank you, DESSIMA, for your time. To the issue of carbon trading now, which is really our big focus this week, the idea of essentially paying for carbon emissions. Now, if you or I wanted to do that, we could, for example, offset our flights when you pay for the planting of trees when you travel to supposedly even out the effects of the plane's emissions on that flight. Companies, though, and we're specifically talking Europe here, have got a much more stringent framework to follow. But there is a lot of conjecture over how effective it is. Here is how it works, basically. Governments set a limit or cap on the amount of carbon dioxide a company can emit by giving them a number of free emissions permits. If the company goes over that cap, it has to start trading permits on an emissions market. In other words, it has to pay more to pollute more. Plus, the supply of permits is limited, so the price will stay high and companies will be less inclined to buy more of them. Pretty simple so far, but then look at the flip side. This is concerning the EU's emissions trading scheme, a UBS report which estimates the cost passed on to consumers will total $280 billion by 2025, that it has had almost zero impact on reducing emissions, and that it expects the price of carbon to in fact collapse because of oversupply. Now, we mentioned the UBS report in there, and one of its authors is LEKANDER, who I'm pleased to say joins us this week from Paris. Per, I think it is important to start by explaining this market itself. You know, when we talk about the price of carbon or trading carbon, what are we actually talking about here? Because physically, carbon is a chemical element. How do you trade in it then?
Well, we are talking about the cost of emitting. So what you really do is that you put an overall limit, often called cap, on how much you're allowed to emit, and then you distribute some papers up to that limit. So let's say you're allowed to emit 100, then you emit papers which are at a bit below 100, because if you would put it at 100, there would be no value. So let's say you issued 90. So that creates a constraint, and that constraint should create a price. And given that you have this price, of course, the participants will try to limit the emissions until you reach the 90 target. And that's really what emission trading is about. So you also have to say, you have to have a penalty for not reaching the target, because otherwise, of course, nothing would happen. But it's really a market mechanism to get down the emissions.
And it's your belief that that's not working, that the whole theory behind the system is flawed and it's actually costing consumers. I see a number here, you've got 210 billion euros as a cost. How do you come to that number?
Yeah, so it's costing us via our electricity bills, because it's driving up the cost of generating electricity, and that is, of course, put on to the consumers. And I estimate, the 210 billion was over a long period of time, 15 years. But if you look on 2012 alone, I'm estimating that it's costing European electricity customers around 18 billion euros due to the fact that it's driving up the cost of generating.
So wouldn't it make more sense then just to target the companies directly, rather than giving them an allowance and then effectively giving them an advance on their allowance, letting them buy more credits if they need? Just go after the biggest emitters and tax them directly. We know which industries and which companies are the biggest emitters.
Yeah, I think that's really what should be done. I think the problem, it sounds very nice in theory to deal with markets, but if you create such a political market, you're open to a lot of problems. One problem is, of course, that you have unintended consequences, and this of driving up the electricity price is one of them, and that's actually generates some windfall profits. Second problem is, of course, that you become a victim to different lobbying groups, and that has happened here as well. So I really think that either you just restrict emissions and say that if you select the most polluting plants and you just tell them you have 5 years to clean up the mess, or you just shut down. Or secondly, and given Europe's general situation on the economy, that's probably the right one, to just tax it. It would much simpler, cost much less, and actually put the burden on the companies, not on the consumers, as this is doing.
So in your opinion, why have these things not been considered over the course of this EU trading scheme? Is it, as you say, that it became a political tool and was almost set up as a political tool, and as such the idea of the businesses involved almost came second in a way?
Yeah, I think it's both an issue about a bit of an error in theory and a bit in practice due to lobbying. So if you first think about the theory, markets are good because the idea with markets is that politicians can never determine of where is most efficient to deal with things, but that's best done by the market. But here it's actually extremely easy to pinpoint what the biggest emitters are. There even exists a list from the European Commission with the 50 largest emitters in Europe. And if you just would close them down, you would have saved 25% of the overall emissions. So that's kind of the error with the theory. It's not difficult to say where the CO2 is coming from. It's coming from large coal power plants, large steel plants, and large cement plants. That's the biggest polluters. Then if you think about the implementation aspect of it, so on this I talked about you said 210 billion over a 15-year period, or I said 18 over 1 year. If you look on it, it's really some quite extraordinary things which are happening here. For instance, the largest 10 billion of my 18 billion is going to European coal producers. And that is coming because the coal lobby managed to get some free carbon allowances. So what really happens here is that the coal producer is passing through to the customer a cost which they really don't have, because they have got a large share of the carbon allowance they need for free.
But isn't this what the EU is actually doing now by going after the airlines and adding them to the scheme? Because they would be arguably one of the biggest emitters of carbon in Europe. If you're talking about targeted ones, this is it.
Yeah, they are, of course they are targeting industries, and the idea is fine. I haven't thought through, and the airline scheme has not started yet, so let's see what unintended consequences there will be there. But I'm pretty sure of that there will be some, and I think that a much simpler scheme, which would be almost as efficient even on the drawing board, and definitely much more practical, would be just to tax them.
That is Per Lekander from the investment bank UBS joining us from Paris with his views on carbon trading. Per, thank you.
Thank you.
And now we're going to get the riposte from the European Commission itself. The Director General of Climate Action at the Commission is Jos DELBEKE, who is with us from Brussels. Mr. DELBEKE, we just heard there the argument that basically carbon trading hasn't worked because it's too loose. These companies, they've got a carbon allowance and then they can trade to get more credits. It's not targeted enough. Your response to that?
Well, I would put it just in the reverse. In fact, the ETS, the carbon market, gives an absolute limit to the total emissions that companies are allowed to make. Now, what we see today is that this total cap has been delivered on at very low prices. So it has turned out to be cheaper instead of more expensive. That is what we anticipated in the beginning. But the environmental outcome of the regime is guaranteed. Now, of course, this begs the question whether the cap needs not a tightening. But that's a policy debate that we may have in the coming months. But that's a separate debate, separate from the fact and from the question whether the carbon market has been delivering the results.
Yes, but why go for a cap in the first place? Why not, as we've suggested previously, tax the biggest emitters directly, make it negative?
Well, we try to build into the system incentives to the economic operators. So if they find cheap ways of delivering the emission reductions, why obstructing that? Why imposing high costs on them? And today we have a deep economic recession in Europe. So it's all not very different from a normal economic logic that in times of recession, prices go down. And that's what we see on our carbon market. It follows very much the economic cycle that we see in other markets, in oil markets, in energy markets, in coal markets, in raw material markets. So prices are lower compared to what they were before. And I even would reverse the argument, and that is to say that if prices would be today as high as they were 3-5 years ago, then we may have a problem, because for our companies it would be much too expensive to deliver the same result.
So all told, are you happy with how this whole scheme has actually worked over the last 15 years? Because again, I'd throw some of the arguments at you which have been given to us, that consumers are the ones who in the end paying the price as well. They, I guess from UBS said this, he said there are higher electricity bills and the like which are passed on to the people.
What do we want to do? We want to limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That's what we are doing. That's the cap. Second, we allow economic operators to deliver that cap at the lowest cost. So there is nothing wrong with that. Where we have questions today, and that's a valid question, whether the price has not fallen to such a low level that it stopped incentivizing further economic actors to produce more emission reductions. But that is de facto a question about strengthening the cap rather than anything else.
Let me ask you about an addition to this scheme, and this is the one concerning the airlines. Now, just this week, Barack Obama, US President, said he was concerned about this addition, about airlines being capped for their emissions. And I guess what he's saying is, well, if I'm a US airline and I fly in and out of Europe, and maybe, just a small portion of the continent, just the west of it, why are you taxing me? I don't come under the EU's banner. Therefore, why do I, as a US airline, get hit as well?
Well, climate change is a global issue, and so we have to operate globally to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions. So I could reverse the question and say, why is it that the Europeans only would have to address the issue and the Americans not? But coming back to the essential question you asked me about whether the carbon market is functioning, if it were not functioning, if it was a complete failure, why would these airline companies be so much afraid about being part of the scheme? We do not see why there is a case for shooting in the foot of European airlines and not treat non-European airlines in the same manner. So that's exactly what we are doing. Everybody who wants to fly in Europe or outside Europe has to be treated by the same regime, and that is the perfect case for avoiding distortionary effects on the competitive conditions of different airline operators.
All right, Jos DELBEKE there from the European Commission's Climate Action Group. We thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you very much.
We want to end on a positive note, though, this week with this issue of climate change. The old adage that every little bit helps and we can all do our part. 2 case studies for you. One from Japan on the rise of the electric car and the amazing example of one man who's in his 80s. And then this first one from Pakistan, where the waste busters are cleaning up the streets while making energy and money. Have a look at this.
This is Gulshan-e-Ravi, a middle-class neighborhood, and these men belong to waste busters, busy sweeping the main roads. Their job is to collect garbage that then gets turned into unseeable gas and fertilizer.
The stench is unbearable, but the work is commendable, and in a country with few resources, people are beginning to realize the potential of utilizing garbage to produce gas, liquefied petroleum products, as well as fertilizer for the farmlands.
This man had a simple idea, recycling garbage to make a profit in an environment-friendly way.
We started off, as I told you, with just 6 donkey carts back in 1996. Today, by the grace of God, we have got over 200 vehicles, about over 3,000 workers, and all of this is money generated from the waste itself.
500 tons of garbage is processed here every day. A separator removes organic waste that is then converted into fertilizer. Further down the chain, these men pick out anything of value, including bottles and plastic bags. The bags are used to make outdoor furniture. The remaining refuse is further compacted to be converted into fuel.
Just imagine all this waste rotting on the streets. It's producing greenhouse gases, methane gas, carbon dioxide, all of this. All of this is depleting the ozone layer.
It took waste busters years before it became successful. But now, the company is being seen in other major Pakistani cities as a green initiative that turns rubbish into money.
You may never have heard of TAKEOKA, but its one-person electric cars are some of the hottest sellers on the Japanese market. 85-year-old EIICHI TAKEOKA used to make the vehicles as a hobby. But as gas prices have risen, demand has grown. And so his signboard business has been converted into an automotive factory. Each car is put together by hand, and TAKEOKA can boast of years of healthy growth at a time when his larger competitors have struggled.
Rather than pursue profits, we put quality and safety first. Profitability just follows naturally as a result.
After decades of focusing on luxury cars and SUVs where profit margins were larger, automakers like Nissan have started to roll into this new market. But on the whole, Japan's automakers admit they have been caught in the headlights and slow to respond. At the Tokyo Auto Show, many EVs remain at the concept stage. In many ways, the beginnings of Japan's auto industry can be traced back to compact, fuel-efficient vehicles like this one. It was in the 1970s during the world oil crisis that Japanese cars first made their name. Another lesson has been to keep costs down. TAKEOKA's electric models retail for just $8,000 US, and plans are underway to build them cheaper outside Japan. which could drive the price down even further.
And that is just about a lot for this week, but if you want to get in touch, here's how you do it. Either send a tweet to me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, all one word. If you're not on Twitter, email is just fine. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our address. And while you're at your computer, you head here, aljazeera.com/business. Link on to the CTC page there where we put all our episodes up in full for you to catch up on. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.